Online is a new frontline. Today, we live in a world where a hacker with a hashtag can have more of an effect than a soldier with a rifle. Cyber war is here, and militaries everywhere are already fighting.
Cyber force, ransomware, cyber attack,
Russian cyber actors,
urgent threat of ransomware.
Imagine for a minute if all the cyber attacks we've already heard about in the news came at once, crippling UK infrastructure and obliterating national security. Healthcare systems brought to their knees, water contaminated, pipelines closed, transport halted, militaries disarmed. A cyber apocalypse. So, how exactly would a cyber apocalypse happen?
My name's Ben Cook. I'm an ex-Royal Marine turned journalist, and this is what I want to find out.
Lots of people think that war is a part of human nature. The landscapes they're being fought on are changing.
We are involved in cyber operations on a daily basis. That can range from against serious and organized crime and child sexual exploitation, right the way through to countering disinformation that might be coming from troll farms, which is trying to undermine the very fabric of our society, and then preparing ourselves for some of the worst case high-end threats. But we're operating in cyberspace constantly and persistently, because this isn't like a military capability that you keep in reserve. You have to be engaged forward all the time to understand and to be able to deter the threat.
We've heard politicians and military officers mention cyber more and more in recent years. But what exactly is it?
This is David Goldberry. He's a cyber war expert and can tell me the basics.
Cyber itself, as you would imagine, just has to do with information technologies or information machines. Cyber is referred to as near kinetic, much in the way that we think about the power of nuclear weapons is not only kinetic, but actually it has a power even before it's used. Kinetic being essentially has this idea to effectively move something, to change something, or to damage something.
Today, the line between the physical and the virtual world is blurred.
Countries around the world are working hard to influence populations everywhere. Whether for political or economic reasons, new technology is making this far easier. Today, the real battle isn't for land, it's for your attention. But who are the big players?
According to cyber experts, Russia and China pose the biggest threat to the West. And then there's Iran and North Korea. But the reality is more complex than that. Kieran Martin spent years protecting the UK from some of the biggest cyber threats out there.
For the first time in human history, you can do sustained harm to another country without you or anyone working alongside you setting foot on its territory or the territory of an ally.
If a bomb goes off in a city, it's claimed by a group, governments then say it probably is the group, that's all fairly simple. Where it gets a lot more complicated though, and this happens an awful lot, is where you've got potentially a state link or where it's based on more conventional criminality. A number of countries, particularly the former Soviet Union, but not exclusively, have obviously a lot of hackers operating on their soil. Sometimes those countries are trying to clamp down on them, sometimes they're allowing them to operate with a degree of impunity, and sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. So that gets really, really complicated, and obviously if you're a country that is attempting to wage a form of ambiguous warfare or shadow warfare, so trying to inflict damage on an adversary without being open about it, the same way the US was with Iran, same way Russia is with a lot of adversaries in Eastern Europe, then you're going to be using cyber because it's a way of doing stuff where it's a lot harder to give 100% proof positive that it was you. And that's one of the reasons why people like using these tools.
Now that I'm beginning to get my head around what cyber warfare is, what's shocking is how much of it is already happening.
Gray zone is the latest of the buzzwords that we use to describe changes in warfare.
The gray zone might be how we get into a war, but it's also how we avoid it. It's how countries are kind of grinding up against each other in ways that don't become existential threats, but do, in some cases, cause chaos and kill a lot of people.
To better understand the possibility of a cyber apocalypse, I need to learn more about the types of cyber warfare out there.
Like conventional war, in cyber war, gaining intelligence is crucial. The first stage of the apocalypse is cyber espionage.
Cyber espionage is probably older than the phrase or the concept of cyber. From the very beginning of information technologies, the notion is that you would use those as a way to not only to see what's happening, reconnaissance in terms of our espionage, in terms of your adversaries. We find out that the US is reading German emails, for instance, in the Chancellor's office, that it's actually a way to check up on your allies as well.
So if you're there to spy, you have to lurk and evade those systems. If you're there to disrupt them, you don't really care. If you're there to steal data, you want to be pretty quiet as well, at least at the start. And again, there are lessons here for defenders. So when the Americans lost in one of the most strategically damaging cyber incidents of all time, the Americans lost their entire federal government database to the Chinese. So everybody who'd applied for a federal government security clearance in the first 14 years of this century, 22.5 million people. In that case, it is believed that the hackers spent more than 24 hours copying data using the computing power of the organization they were stealing from, and nobody noticed. So that, again, that's a sort of lesson for defenders. You know, if the anomaly detection is there, then it has to be linked up to a human being going, there's something really weird going on over there, and you need to, and we need to deal something about it.
This sort of thing is happening all the time. It seems to me like no one's safe, and worse still, when it does happen, you might not even know about it. Espionage is one of the oldest tricks in the book, and the cyber domain just makes it easier. Countries want to uncover each other's secrets, but what exactly is it they want to know?
We've always talked about the big four of hostile nation states, but I would break them down into two, and even then they're quite different. So the big two are China and Russia. So Russian attacks tend to be about geopolitics, so undermining confidence in the political process, that sort of thing. Reconnoitering energy systems just in case, you know, they need to. The fundamental nature of China's cybersecurity operations were economic originally. It was part of the, you know, rapid economic development. So let's steal other people's intellectual property. You know, British companies making a really interesting patented drug, let's just nick it, and then we can, you know, we can get there first, or we can knock off this very clever piece of automotive engineering that Britain or America has done, and that was the nature of the Chinese. The Chinese threat is now moving into a much more complicated and challenging area, which is around actually owning the infrastructure of the internet, dominating the way in which technology develops and is built, because at the minute, until quite recently, you know, we've been playing on America's internet. You know, the US built the internet, the West Coast private sector built the internet. The Russians are very good at cheating in that game and undermining it. The Chinese are building a completely different, more authoritarian model of technology, which challenges sort of Western freedoms, and in a sense the two, people now talk about a tech Cold War, and I think that's right. So those are the sort of big two. Iran and North Korea are the next two, and the other sort of two of the four nation states that we most worry about. And it's not so much a matter of technical sophistication, it's willingness to act. You know, there are all sorts of countries with decent cyber attack capabilities, but they choose not to use them. Certainly they choose not to use them against the United Kingdom or the United States, but these two do. Obviously, in the last 10, 15 years, the West has been at loggerheads with both Iran and North Korea pretty much constantly, but there have been peaks in terms of tension, and Iran attacked Wall Street in 2012 at the time of one such incident. North Korea attacked Sony Pictures famously when they made a disparaging movie about the Kim dynasty. And North Korea since then has a regime that's very short of money because of all the sanctions. North Korea has turned into what the US government has called the world's sort of first state-sponsored cyber cash thief. And so it's doing a lot of attacks on the global financial system. It nicked $81 million from the Bank of Bangladesh about 5-6 years ago. And of course it was behind the WannaCry attack that disrupted healthcare in the UK, albeit unintentionally. So those are the sort of four nation states that we most worry about.
Of course, everyone's doing it as part of their national security. Take claims made surrounding US spy operations against their EU allies, or Russia's espionage operations launched against Ukraine years before the 2014 annexation of Crimea. These tactics are common practice for everyone, and not just those we hear about in the news.
With so many instances, I wonder what this could mean for already brittle relationships between great nations.
So great powers are still trying to get their heads around both how they use cyber, but also how they control it and how they talk to each other about it. So you'll see now, there's been contact for a while between Russian academics, Chinese academics, American academics in particular. You've seen a number of conferences. The UK hosted one several years ago, trying to agree rules of the road in cyberspace. And you see that when you have summits, you will see that cyber comes up as an increasingly important topic. And that tells you how seriously they take this, and also how they're really nervous that this could start something that no side could really control.
So where would cyber espionage fit into the cyber apocalypse? Well, it could be used by a country to gain vital information about military positions, anti-air deterrence, or strategically placed submarines. It could happen weeks, months, even years before a physical invasion, and could mean gaining the upper hand. The next stage in the cyber apocalypse is propaganda and disinformation.
Propaganda and disinformation is much more difficult than something like cyber, where actually what you're using is almost psychological ideas to have a much broader effect. Something like the US Air Force dropping Budweiser over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in order to essentially not only to make them happier that they're being given beer by the Americans, but also to slow them down because they thought that they would get drunk. As an effect, actually, it had no effect on the resolve or the effectiveness of the North Vietnamese, but actually made them very fond of Budweiser. So it's very difficult to control propaganda and disinformation. Actually, disinformation is something that once it's let loose has something like a chaotic effect.
Like cyber espionage, these tactics are used as soft threats to affect populations far and wide. Conventional propaganda is the control of information to manipulate public perception towards a certain viewpoint. For years, people have used the media to promote their ideologies, recruit new members, and justify their actions. And propaganda in the cyber domain is no different. It's just that today, social media makes things a whole lot easier.
So we are in a world now where virality trumps veracity when it comes to the power of information. Power in terms of information's ability to shape not just your beliefs, but your actions. And not just your beliefs online and your actions online, but your beliefs and actions in the real world. When it comes to the power of information, it is more important now that it go viral than it be true.
People usually make their decisions based on the information available to them. Simple, right? As most of the time we take the news we consume as truth. But what about disinformation or fake news?
Fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The term fake news only seems to have surfaced in recent years. But it's no new thing. It's just as we've become more digitized, it's far easier for it to spread.
Even truthful information can be an attack. I penetrate your network, I steal information from it, I steal your email, and I spread it. I can also spread false information. And again, it might be either that I've stolen and I'm spreading that false information, or it's the essence of what we've called like war. So in this case, I'm spreading information, I'm driving it viral through a mix of likes and shares and lies. And so in this is what we've seen, everything from celebrities to celebrities turned politicians like Donald Trump, to Russian information warriors, to ISIS, to even good guy groups, whether it's activist campaigns or corporations or whatnot. What they're after here is the spread of information, making it go viral across our society to shape people's actions. We can see, positive effects of that. Spreading information, good health information. You should wear a mask. You should get a vaccine. Or spreading deliberate disinformation. Spreading false stories about vaccines. So that's what you can do. We've also seen authoritarian states not just try to censor what their own populations are seeing. We've also seen through social media their ability to, in a sense, censor what other, even democratic populations are seeing. That is, they're not able to prevent things from being seen by an audience, be it in the United States, in a Britain, in a France, in a NATO partner, but they are able to spread false information to, in a sense, bury the truth underneath a sea of lies.
What about disinformation on home soil, here in the UK?
Russia poses an immediate and urgent threat to our national security.
Propaganda and disinformation happen quietly in the background, affecting a population who don't have a clue that it's happening in the first place.
Disinformation is really simple. It's just a sexier name for lies and falsehoods. So it's essentially where you take what is happening in the world and you try and you lie about it, and you try and give impressions about things that are incorrect, and you're doing it for political or geopolitical gain. It's not new. Obviously, there are new ways you can do it online. But I think it's really important to realize that not to get too hung up on it, because I don't think that our adversaries think about disinformation the same way we do. What Russia and China are thinking about when they look at the world is narratives. They are looking at pushing narratives that say that they are getting stronger and the West is getting weaker, and they will use whatever they can for that, but their first choice is where they can is to use the truth. It's to use examples of things that they can really point at, Western withdrawal from Afghanistan, COVID going badly, you name it, and use those things to push narratives that serve their interests and do not serve ours.
Cyber attacks like cyber espionage, propaganda, and disinformation could be followed by threats such as economic disruption and sabotage. This is where the line becomes even blurrier. How, in an interconnected world, cyber attacks become destructive. Next up in the cyber apocalypse is what's known as economic disruption.
Economic disruption would be something historically we would think about it in very kind of mercantilist ways. And so we would understand economic disruption traditionally through something like naval blockades or airspace control or something like this. And more recently, what we've seen is economic deterioration happening because of cyber attacks. And in many ways, this may be something like a denial of service attack, which essentially shuts down a company so that it can't trade to the same extent that it used to. But as we see even more recently, it's about taking websites offline, not necessarily always about theft. In many cases, it's actually part of a larger scheme as to understand how your cyber offensive mechanisms are, how effective they're being.
I don't know about you, but when I think of hacking, I imagine someone in a hoodie with a screen full of ones and zeros. You might remember the WannaCry hack back in 2017. North Korean state hackers unintentionally infected over 200,000 computers around the world, some of which belong to the NHS, causing almost 7,000 hospital appointments to be cancelled and cost the UK government almost £92 million to fix it.
Although no one died as a direct result of WannaCry, it stands as an example where hackers enact real damage to a society. It showed some of the vulnerabilities of one of the UK's most important institutions.
So far in the cyber apocalypse, state secrets have been unearthed, the population is at war, and critical national infrastructure, like the health services, have been rendered useless.
But what would happen if an aggressor wanted to compromise military systems or destroy water, power, or fuel supplies?
The final piece of the cyber apocalypse puzzle is sabotage.
What we're seeing is major countries being really, really worried about what it would take to actually take down each other's national infrastructure. So you're seeing China, Russia, United States really thinking about what a really serious conflict would be like, and what they could do both to each other's civilian infrastructure, but also how that would fit into normal military confrontation. And that means looking at things like blocking out communications to ships, blocking out communications to planes, taking down satellites electronically, and just doing things that will affect the battle space and affect all of that kit on which Western and other militaries have been depending.
Stuxnet was arguably to this day the most comprehensive cyber attack that we've had. This was planned by a number of countries, the United States and Israel, and it had the help of a few others. And the aim was to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program. The operation was called Olympic Games. What they'd achieved was they basically made the centrifuges in Natanz facility in Iran to work in a way that would have minor faults for an extended period of time that would basically make the engineers think there was a problem with the machines rather than being at the receiving end of a cyber attack. And a few years after this, Iran sat at the table and agreed on the nuclear deal with a number of countries. So it can be said that was actually a success in this, that there was a result. Although some people would say that the attack in itself did not have a very long-lasting effect, in the sense that eventually Iran was able to fix it and resume its operations. But others would say that time that was gained was essential for Iran to sit at a table.
And one of the interesting things is a lot of our infrastructure is actually connected to the internet. And one of the challenges for many Western governments is how do you harden your infrastructure and your critical infrastructure, like your power or electricity grid, for instance.
Today, countries around the world rely on electric power grids. Without them, they couldn't function. In the event of a cyber apocalypse, hackers could target these and, as a result, sabotage the electrical supply to millions of people. And it doesn't take much to imagine the consequences. It became clear after Stuxnet that cyber can be used offensively, and to a big effect. To date, Stuxnet is the most bona fide example of an actual cyber warfare operation, meaning its effect equivalent to those of a military attack. But what about the ethical implications of cyber attacks, particularly with operations involving sabotage? Whereas conventional war follows a strict set of rules, known as the law of armed conflict, cyber warfare does not.
The ways in which you can be, let's call it, aggressive in cyberspace has increased. For example, we've seen an increasing number of ransomware attacks, right? For which you don't need to have a very sophisticated capability in order to engage in this. The more sophisticated attacks, those that can really be, strategically relevant, I would say those are limited to a few countries around the world so far. It's actually a low-level form of trying to achieve your strategic aims. And for some authors, that actually has a positive side to it, which is you may be able to do things in a way that is more or less peaceful, that would otherwise demand the use of force.
We're basically talking about the very commonplace situation where primarily state actors are utilizing a mix of traditional military, but also traditionally non-military means to compete back and forth, to attack with their adversaries. So it is not solely, I am doing 1939 style, I have declared war and now my tanks cross your border and we are wearing uniforms, but rather we're using a blend of state and non-state assets. It might be anything from Spetsnaz commandos to hackers who are pivoting back and forth between hacking banks and hacking computer networks. I'm mixing information warriors who might be spreading disinformation about a NATO unit deployed to Lithuania or about an election.
Hold on, this all sounds familiar. You'd be right in thinking that some of the types of attacks our experts have spoken about were used by Russia before they invaded Ukraine back in February 22. Cyber is, and has for some time, been a crucial chapter in the Kremlin's playbook. Putin and other autocratic leaders use cyber to seize more power in the countries they rule and those they wish to influence. But what about non-state actors? They don't tend to operate under the same law as most nation-states.
To do a minor act of harassment and aggression on the internet's quite easy. To do a really sophisticated hack that disrupts the life of a city and puts people's lives in danger is thankfully quite hard.
non-state actors can have just as much a part to play in cyber war as conventional militaries.
Groups of malware developers pose a significant threat as they can impact global politics and cyber warfare. Nowadays, black markets offer such cyber weapons to the highest bidder, with zero care for the consequences.
If these people are prepared to do horrific things like fly planes into buildings, blow themselves up on public transport and so forth, presumably they'd be willing to cause serious harm in cyberspace if they could.
To govern cyberspace is, of course, a monumental task, and something the world is only just coming to grips with. The future is unknown, but it's a threat that's hot on the lips of global leaders everywhere.
Cyberforce.
Cyber.
But what about sabotage in our cyber apocalypse? Saboteurs could target computers and satellites. They could compromise military systems, such as surveillance assets, leading to their interception or replacement with something malicious. Power, water, fuel, communications, and transportation infrastructure are all vulnerable to sabotage. By this stage, the UK is effectively on its knees. Its operational capability would be akin to pre-World War days.
So, will it happen? Will we see a cyber apocalypse?
The most likely scenario you're going to see is a lot of disruption to how people access information, how people access basic services like banking, and maybe how people access news. The most dangerous scenario, though, is that what's happening in cyber escalates beyond cyber. And the risk is that that starts either cyber attacks that kill people, so taking down a power grid that turns off intensive care machines, crashing vehicles, trapping people on underground trains and so forth, bringing down planes, all of that's possible. But fundamentally, the real risk is that what happens with that is that it creates circumstances where actual missiles start flying, where you end up in a war that people can't control. And that's always the greatest risk of any new form of warfare. And with cyber, I think that's something that's been to really preoccupy people.
It isn't all doom and gloom. The world has experts everywhere protecting us from an attack of this scale. Out of the cyber threats that take place, hundreds, if not thousands, are stopped, and our capability grows stronger day by day. Organisations across all sectors have smart people making sure a cyber apocalypse doesn't ever happen.
By looking after the digital environment, I'm beginning to think that we are doing a public good. It's like picking up litter. The internet is awash with toxic malevolence, and I don't just mean some of the content on social media, I mean the malware. And the more we can do to clean that up, and the more we can do to strengthen our systems. There's always this question about, should we focus on exploiting the internet insecurity of others for our own national security benefit, or should we focus on fixing our own vulnerabilities? And obviously we need both, but I think overall Western free, open, liberal, rule of law, democratic societies have far more to benefit from making the technology safer than we do from having a sort of Wild West where no matter how good we are, we'll always be more vulnerable than authoritarian countries.
The responsibility is for everyone. It's the same thing if you were talking about public health. You would never in public health say, well, there's only a role for government. There's no role for business. There's no role for individuals. No, you need a role for everyone coming together. Same thing in cybersecurity. No one would say, oh, well, the British government has GCHQ. I guess my mom doesn't need a good password on her email account. You need a role for everyone.
I suppose we just need to be aware of some of the threats out there. Right?
Cyber isn't the only faceless threat. Coming up in the next episode, we explore the threat disasters pose to a society and whether the military is a help or a hindrance amidst the chaos. In the meantime, we'd love to hear whether you think we'll see a cyber apocalypse. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe for military stories that you won't want to miss.